It all started on what I thought would be just another ordinary day. The morning was quiet, the kind of stillness that hides the storm waiting ahead. My husband had left for work early, like he usually did, barely saying more than a hurried goodbye before rushing out the door. Our marriage had slowly slipped into a routine, predictable, dull, and sometimes painfully distant. I loved him, or at least I told myself I did, but lately I had been feeling invisible, like a shadow moving around a house that no longer felt like home. That afternoon, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. My reflection looked tired, lifeless, and older than I wanted to admit. On impulse, I reached for something I hadn't worn in years, a short, fitted miniskirt. It was playful, bold, and completely unlike the clothes I usually wore around the house. For a moment, I felt young again, as if I could bring back the spark I thought I had lost. Not long after, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I found my nephew standing there, smiling, carrying a few bags. He had stopped by unexpectedly, offering to drop off some groceries his mother had sent for me. He was polite, charming, and full of the kind of energy my life seemed to lack. I thanked him, trying to act natural, but as he stepped inside, I noticed his eyes linger for just a fraction of a second longer than they should have. It wasn't obvious, but it wasn't my imagination either. As I guided him into the kitchen, I suddenly became conscious of what I was wearing. The skirt that had made me feel alive minutes earlier now made me feel exposed. I laughed nervously, brushing it off, and we spoke casually while putting the groceries away. Yet, there was an unspoken tension in the air that hadn't been there before. Every time his eyes met mine, I felt something stir deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. When he finally left, I stood by the door, heart racing, trying to convince myself that nothing unusual had happened. But as much as I wanted to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the way he had looked at me, or the way I had felt under his gaze. That fleeting moment planted a seed of curiosity, and little did I know, it was the beginning of something that would change everything. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying that moment over and over in my mind. I told myself it was innocent, just a harmless slip of attention, but my thoughts betrayed me. Why had his glance lingered? Why had my pulse quickened in response? I tried to push it aside, but the truth was I craved the attention, the spark of feeling seen again. My nephew began stopping by more often. At first, it was under simple excuses, bringing something from his mother, helping me carry things, or just checking in. But soon, the visits seemed less about errands and more about simply being around. And I didn't stop him. Each time he came, our conversations grew a little longer, a little deeper, crossing lines I hadn't expected. What started as casual chats slowly shifted into playful teasing. He'd compliment my cooking, or casually remark that I looked younger than my age. I laughed it off, but inside, his words touched something that had been starved for too long. I began to notice details about him I had never really paid attention to before, the way he carried himself, his confidence, his smile. My husband, meanwhile, seemed more distant than ever. Long nights at work, constant distractions, barely any warmth left between us. When he was home, it felt as though he was just physically present, his mind always somewhere else. The contrast between his coldness and my nephew's attention only deepened my confusion. One evening, my nephew offered to help fix a loose cabinet door in the kitchen. I stood nearby, watching as he worked, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension. When he stood up and brushed his hand against mine while handing me a screwdriver, the touch lingered a second too long. My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly turned away, my cheeks burning. From that moment, I couldn't deny it anymore. Something dangerous was building between us. I found myself dressing with more care whenever I expected him to visit, unconsciously hoping he would notice. Every glance, every accidental touch, every unspoken word pushed me closer to a line I knew I shouldn't cross. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I couldn't sleep. My mind was filled with thoughts of my nephew, the way his eyes lingered, the way his presence made me feel alive. I hated myself for it, yet I couldn't let it go. By the time morning came, I knew that I was no longer just imagining things. I was in the middle of something I couldn't control. The turning point came on a quiet afternoon when my husband was away on yet another business trip. I had invited my nephew over to help carry some boxes into the storage room. It seemed harmless enough, but deep down, I knew I wanted him there for more than just the help. As we worked together, our hands brushed against each other repeatedly, each touch sparking something stronger, more undeniable. At one point, I dropped a box, and when he bent down to pick it up, his hand rested over mine. Neither of us moved right away. For a moment, the silence in the room was deafening, filled with the pounding of my heart. When I finally looked up, our eyes locked, and in that instant, everything I had tried to suppress came rushing to the surface. He leaned closer, his breath warm against my skin, and I didn't move away. The world outside seemed to vanish, leaving only the two of us suspended in that dangerous moment. The kiss was brief, hesitant, but it shattered the fragile boundaries we had been clinging to. When it ended, I stepped back, trembling, my mind spinning with guilt and exhilaration. I knew it was wrong, that it crossed every line imaginable, but I couldn't deny how alive it made me feel. For days afterward, I couldn't escape the memory of it. Every glance, every word between us was charged with the knowledge of what had happened. I tried to act normal around my husband, but I felt like every movement, every word betrayed me. I became paranoid, jumping at the sound of his footsteps, terrified he might notice the change in me. Yet despite the guilt, I found myself drawn closer to my nephew, unable to resist the magnetic pull. Each time we were alone, the tension grew heavier, threatening to consume us both. There was no going back now, we had stepped over a line, and no matter how hard I tried to pretend otherwise, the truth was written across every stolen moment we shared. The worst part was knowing how fragile it all was. One wrong move, one careless mistake, and everything would come crashing down. But even that fear couldn't stop me. I had opened a door that could never be closed again, and with every passing day, I felt myself slipping deeper into a web I had woven with my own hands. The weight of my secret grew heavier with each passing day. My husband began to notice my distraction, the way I avoided his eyes, the way I flinched when he touched me. I told myself he was too wrapped up in his work to suspect anything, but I underestimated him. It started with small questions: where had I been, who had stopped by, why was I suddenly spending so much time cleaning or dressing up at home? I brushed him off with practiced smiles, but the suspicion in his eyes grew sharper. Meanwhile, my nephew's visits became more cautious, our conversations laced with an unspoken fear of being discovered. Then, one evening, everything unraveled. My husband came home earlier than expected and found my nephew in the living room, helping me move some furniture. The look in his eyes when he entered the room was one I will never forget: sharp, suspicious, filled with questions he didn't need to ask. He said nothing in that moment, but I knew he had seen enough to confirm his worst fears. Later that night, after my nephew had left, my husband confronted me. His words cut like knives, each question tearing through the fragile lies I had built. I tried to deny it, to protect myself, but deep down, I knew the truth was written across my face. The silence between us was worse than any shouting. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and heartbreak, and I realized that in one reckless moment, I had destroyed everything we had built together. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. My nephew stopped visiting, leaving me alone with the crushing weight of guilt and regret. My husband withdrew completely, his coldness more painful than any argument. The house that had once felt empty now felt unbearable, filled with the ghosts of choices I couldn't undo. I often replay that first moment, the miniskirt, the glance, the spark that started it all. If I had just ignored it, if I had just chosen differently, maybe things would have been different. But I didn't, and now I live with the consequences. What shocked me most wasn't the betrayal itself, but how quickly one small moment spiraled out of control, how one glance could lead to a downfall I never imagined. In chasing a feeling of being alive again, I lost everything that truly mattered. And now, all that remains is the haunting reminder that one moment of weakness can change an entire life forever.